TimeMorpher is one of the new nodes, or set of nodes, added to snowFlaKe version 3. It's an incredibly versatile animation tool for view within functions and graphs. It can be used to animate basically any value within materials or within altitude functions for terrains or object graphs. What I want to show you right now is how to animate a procedural terrain and link the materials to the animation using TimeMorpher. So just adding a procedural terrain to the scene, I'm going to edit the object, and we're going to go into the procedural tab to edit the altitude production. And what we have is just a simple fractal creating this terrain. Also, the edges are being zeroed out within the terrain editor. We do have zero edges turned on. And we can keep that on for the animation and just transform the fractal being used to generate the terrain. It's possible to perform the animation directly within one function of a single terrain, or you can create multiple terrains for each key or transition, and then using external dependencies link them. First, what I'm going to show you is how to do this within one single altitude graph for terrain. And what we're going to do is add, let's go ahead and pick another fractal to use. We're going to add in a fractal node connected to our multiply by constant so that the scale is going to match correctly. And I'm just going to go ahead and connect this output to the altitude. And now it is going to create an identical one the previous because I did have the other one selected. We're going to switch this over to a terrain fractal. And let's make a few modifications. These modifications can also be animated over time using TimeMorpher. But what we're going to do is focus on just kind of transitioning between terrains at the moment. Now, because we're using zero edges, it's a good idea to preview what that's going to look like. We could also use the advanced zero edges included with snowFlaKe in order to perform that action within the function editor. But for now, I'm going to leave that open, just using the function or the view terrain editor for that. I'm going to add in a combiner node, set it to blender, and we're going to change the ratio to be able to view that new terrain fractal. Click OK, and now we can see it, what it's going to look like when the edges are zeroed. And let's go ahead and add in one more fractal to transition to. So we'll select that terrain fractal. Connect it to the multiply by constant up at the top. And I'm going to go ahead and replace the link. Or actually what I'm going to do is add another blender. Just because sometimes when things are not connected, they will be deleted from the function when you close out the editor. So what we're doing right now by blending the ratios is we're really just showing one of these options, but we're leaving the rest of them connected so that that way we'll make sure they're still going to be part of the function once we close it out. So let's go ahead and switch this over to billows, increase the largest feature and the meta scale a bit, just to give us something new. Click OK and take a look at how it's going to show up once the edges are zeroed. And that looks like it should be pretty good. So what we're going to do is transition between these three using TimeMorpher, TimeMorpher Auto to be more specific, because it does take care of some of these blenders for us. The way TimeMorpher works is it outputs a ratio of 0 to 1. So if you want to use the input node, MetaNode, TimeMorpher, in the non-auto version, this is for connecting directly to these blenders, where we would connect to the ratio. And then TimeMorpher controls that ratio blend relative to the time settings. But we're going to take a look at the auto setup mode, which has these blenders integrated into it. Makes it a little easier to set up. So what I'm going to do is just align these, and we can delete the blenders and the altitude connection for now, and load in a combiner node. The TimeMorpher auto nodes are set in the combiner section of MetaNodes, whereas the ratio-controlled TimeMorpher without the integrated combiners or blenders are within the combiner node MetaNodes. So we're going to use TimeMorpher auto. Auto is, or will control colors, vectors, and numbers. Right now we're controlling numbers. What we could also use is if we go back into the menu and take a look, there are a couple of other setups within the additional, so TimeMorpher Auto Additional. And if we open this up, it's going to show our other options. Because the main TimeMorpher Auto deals with color, vector, and number, if you have a really long chain of these different nodes, you've got a lot of extra information being put out that you might not need. So these are set up specifically for what you want to control. So we've got one for color, one for numbers, one with a double texture coordinate, and a vector. So we could even take this out of here. I could copy the number one and paste it in. So that way we don't have the additional outputs. We can just deal directly with numbers. So let's go ahead and use that one instead. The color one is obviously going to be for materials. Vectors will work within just about any function. So to start out, the first TimeMorpher, now we're going to need at least 2 of these to make our chain, so we can copy and paste it. And the top, whichever TimeMorpher is on top, needs to be connected to the top time input. The next one has a time input, and we want to connect that to the output time of the previous TimeMorpher. Because what is happening is it's going to take the information that's keyed into the previous morph and delay the next transition. It also takes into account pre-delays, so that way you can have overlapping morphs, which is pretty neat. So we have a start and end value within the TimeMorpher. So wherever we're going to start at, you can either extract that and connect it to our altitude, or you can find the end on the side of the node if you have show parameter connections turned on, and connect that to the end. So now if we take a look, we also want to take our final altitude and connect that to the number output, because we are working with numbers. Time and ratio. The ratio is the ability to control an additional blender, like the input node. So if you did want it to work that way. And then what we want to do in order to make sure these transition correctly is the start of the next TimeMorpher in the chain connects to the number output of the previous TimeMorpher. So now the start of this TimeMorpher is going to be the end of the first TimeMorph, which is the secondary terrain fractal. So let's go ahead and name these 1, 2, and 3, so we can refer to them a little bit easier. We'll extract the end of the second morph, set it to the altitude. So now our first transition is between 1 and 2, and the second is between 2 and 3. And now the way we can control the animation is first we have a pre-delay. If you would like there to be a delay of time before the transition starts between 1 and 2, you enter it in here. And this is by second, so if we wanted a 2-second delay before the animation starts, we type in 2. This information is passed over to the second TimeMorph within a morph chain, so that way its animation is offset and it'll work correctly. So we have a 2-second delay. We can also set that up to be negative numbers, and that will also pass that information correctly to the next morph. I'm going to stick with 0 for now and not have any delay whatsoever. The transition is the total time it takes to get from the first or the start input to the end input. So from 1 to 2, how long is that going to take? So we enter in that transition time in seconds. Let's go ahead and type in a value of 3. So it's going to take 3 seconds to get from 1 to 2. Additional options are, if we take a look, there is a transition spline. So this way we can ease the motion in and out and not have something that's completely linear. If you want it to be linear, then you can turn off the curve mode, and that will be a linear transition. TimeMorpher also has the ability to loop animation. So if we were to turn on endless loop, it would loop forever, going from 1 to 2, and then back to 1, and it'll kind of bounce back and forth. If you're going to be using the loop mode, make sure that within the time-spline filter, that the upper clamping mode is set to mirror. Unless you want it to start over back at 1, then you can set it to continue or repeat. If you set it to repeat, then it will start over from 1 to 2 over 3 seconds, and then the loop, it'll bounce back and start again at 1, rather than transitioning back to 1. End loop is if you do want to loop it without an endless loop, you can just type in a number of how many loops it's going to make before it stops. So we can type in a value 2, and it'll loop 2 times before it stops. We're just going to set this to 0. We're not going to be using that. We're going to be setting this up to blend. Now this is just that same blender built in to this, where it has different combination modes of what we would like to do. So if you don't want to just blend between one or the other, you could add the numbers together, subtract, and multiply them together, and that's automatically set up within the node and where the inputs are within the morph. So now we have to choose our transition time for the next node. So to go from 2 to 3, and I'm going to set that duration to be 4, but set up a pre-delay of -1. So the duration is going to be the transition time minus the pre-delay time, or plus the pre-delay, depending if it's negative or positive, plus the transition time of the previous. So with a pre-delay set to -1, it's going to subtract from the transition time of the previous node, so that this transition between whatever is still appearing between 1 and 2 is going to start at 2 seconds into the animation rather than 3, because we have a negative setup. So the total length of the animation right now is 6 seconds. 3 seconds for the first transition, 4 seconds for the second transition, but with the pre-delay it's offset by 1, so that's going to add only 3 to it. So this is already set up and ready to be animated for a 6-second animation. I want View to basically trigger this animation. You need to set up a keyframe on any object, really. I'm not going to be using the procedural terrain for that. It's not needed. I'm going to go ahead and hit F11 on the keyboard to pull up the timeline. I'm going to select the ground object, and 6 seconds into the animation, which I will need to scale this. So I'm going to hold down Control and right-click in order to zoom out. Move 6 seconds in, and add a position keyframe. Actually, I'm going to turn off auto keyframing and add a position keyframe for the ground. This is just letting View know that we have an animation within that time frame. I'm not moving the ground, but since functions and using TimeMorpher, it's all automatic. The keyframes are defined by the nodes. we do need to tell View that it is going to be animated over a certain amount of time. So right now, we're not going to see an update in the OpenGL preview. We will see one in the render on the right as we change the time. The only way to get the terrain to update within the OpenGL is to edit the terrain, and you also need to go into the function and then click OK in order for that to update. So it won't update automatically just by going into the terrain editor. You do need to open the function as well, which is a change from View 8 into 9. So if you take a look at the timeline in the bottom, or the render preview, I just went ahead and rendered this out. I did move the camera to get behind the object so that the shadows are showing. Since there's no color changes, it was kind of difficult to see from before. So you can just see the transitions taking place and easing in and out of each other. So once we hit 2 seconds, the transition from number 2 to 3 starts before transition from 1 to 2 gets to finish because of that pre-delay. And it makes for a pretty nice, smooth blend. So what about controlling materials? We also want to control, and we're going to set up something pretty basic, just controlling the alpha of different layers. And we can make them dependent on the current morph setup so that we don't have to create additional time morphs or a different morph chain within the material. We can set it up for external dependence. So what we're going to do is, within the terrain editor altitude function, we're going to add output node custom dependency, and I'm going to copy and paste. And we're going to name these morph1 and morph2. And we're going to connect these to the ratio output. And now we can load in the materials we want to use. So this has just got the default material on it. Let's go ahead and load in. We'll start with, let's make it grassy to start with. So we'll use large scale grass. Now with the current version of Vue, it is going to have an issue with the alpha. Now this has always shown up whether or not you want to ignore the alpha information. But since the alpha information has become available within the material editor, editing it can cause some issues. So I'm going to go ahead and accept the information, the alpha. And since it's going to be the bottom layer, it's not going to show. So you don't want to go ahead and edit that altitude production or the alpha production within the bottom material, because it will probably close the program on you. So just watch out for that. What we're going to do now is add, this is our base material, so we want something to transition it into, so we need 2 more materials. So we're going to add new layers. I'm going to add a large scale rock. And then go to the environment tab and just remove any of the slope. I'm just going to have this completely cover the entire object and not have it dependent. Not quite sure why it's asking about the alpha now, since I already loaded it in. I have to make sure that everything's alright here. And it does look like it's working out okay. So now we're going to go ahead and add another material to transition into. And let's pick the Sahara Stone Orange. Set our alpha boost to 0. So that way it's doesn't have any fade or change automatically. And that scale looks like it should be okay. So what we want to do is set this up to control the alpha of the large scale rock and the orange, and those are going to be our secondary and third transition, or the end points of transition 1 and 2. We'll start with the large scale rock, edit the function, and we do need to set up our manual blender. We'll start with a constant number, adding constant node number 1, which is going to be fully transparent, and -1 to make it visible. We're going to add in a blender, clip the ratio 0 to 1, add in input node external dependency, choose the procedural terrain and morph 1. And now we're going to go to the Sahara Stone orange, edit the function, set up the same thing where we're going to do a constant number, or 2 constant numbers, starting with 1, ending with -1, blender, input 0 to the 1, input 1 to the -1, clip the ratio 0 to 1, connect our alpha, and then we're going to add in input node external dependency, and from the procedural terrain, morph 2. So now our material is set up to transition along with the changes in the terrain. If you did want them to be different, you could set up morph chains and TimeMorpher nodes within the material itself to be different. But with the automatic ratio setup, it just does make it a little bit quicker. So I'll go ahead and render out just a little preview of this so you can see what it looks like. Okay, so if you take a look at the bottom, I'm just going to scrub through the animation, and you can see going between those different material setups. So starting with the grass, and then to the large scale rock, and then that Sahara Stone red, to match the morph of the terrain itself changing. So this is just a real simple way of modifying the material. There are much more complex ways you can do this, and using some of the additional nodes, the advanced slope controllers and different filters available within snowFlaKe. And there are example scenes provided with snowFlaKe for TimeMorpher, really showing some more complex setups and some cooler stuff, cooler things you can do with it.